Part 3. The conclusion of The Little Mermaid. The sun had not yet risen when she reached the prince's castle and sat down on the lowest step of the great marble stairs. The moon was still shining clearly. The little mermaid drank the potion, and it felt as if a sword were piercing her little body. She fainted and she lay as though she were dead. When the sun's rays touched the sea, she woke and felt a burning pain. But the young prince stood in front of her and looked at her with coal black eyes. She looked downward and saw then that she no longer had a fishtail, but the most beautiful little slender legs that any girl could wish for. She was naked, and therefore she took her long hair and covered herself with it. The prince asked her who she was and how she had got there. She looked gently and yet ever so sadly up at him with her deep blue eyes, for she could not speak. He took her by the hand and led her up to the castle, and just as the witch had warned, every step felt as though she were walking on sharp knives, but she suffered it gladly. Gracefully as a bubble rising in the water, she walked beside the prince, and everyone who saw her wondered how she could walk so lightly. In the castle, she was clad in royal clothes of silk and muslin. She was the most beautiful of all, but she was mute and could not sing nor speak. Beautiful girls clad in silken clothes embroidered with gold sang for the prince and his royal parents. One sang more beautifully than the rest, and the prince clapped his hands and smiled to her. Then the little mermaid was filled with sorrow, for she knew that she had once sang far more beautifully, and she thought, "Oh, if he only knew that to be with him I gave away my voice for eternity." Now the girls danced gracefully. They moved to the beautiful music. Suddenly the little mermaid lifted her hand and rose up on the tips of her toes. She floated more than danced across the floor. No one had ever seen anyone dance as she did. Her every movement revealed her loveliness. Her eyes spoke far more eloquently than the, than the song. Everyone was delighted, especially the prince. He called her his little foundling. She danced again and again, even though each time her little foot touched the floor, she felt as if she had stepped on a knife. The prince declared that she should never leave him, and she was given permission to sleep in front of his door on a velvet pillow. The prince had men's clothes made for her so that she could accompany him when he went horseback riding. Through the sweet smelling forest they rode, where green branches touched their shoulders and little birds sang among the leaves. Together they climbed the high mountains, and her feet bled so much that the others noticed, but she smiled and followed her prince up even higher until they could see the clouds still below them, sail below them, little like flocks of birds migrating to the foreign land. At night in the castle, while the others slept, she would walk down to the broad marble stairs to the sea and cool her poor burning feet in the cold water. Then she would think of her sisters down in the deep water. One night they came, arm in arm. They rose above the surface of the water, singing ever so sadly. She waved to them, and they recognized her, and they told her how much sorrow she had brought them. After that they visited her every night, and once she saw far out into the sea her old grandmother. It had been years since she had stuck her head up and out into the air, and there too was her father, the Mer King, with his crown on his head. They stretched their hands toward her, but did not dare come as near to the land as her sisters. Day by day the prince grew fonder and fonder of her, but he loved her as he would have loved a good child, and had no thoughts of making her his queen. And she had to become his wife, or she would never have an immortal soul, but on the morning after his marriage would become foam on the green ocean. "Don't you love me more than the others?" was the message in the little mermaid's eyes when the prince kissed her lovely forehead. Yes, you are the dearest to me, said the prince, for you have the kindest heart of them all. You are devoted to me, and you look like a young girl I once saw, and you will probably never see again. I was in a shipwreck. The waves carried me ashore where a holy temple lay. Many young girls were in service there. One of them, the youngest of them all, found me on the beach and saved my life. I saw her only twice, but she is the only one I can love in this world. And you look like her. You almost make her picture disappear from my soul. She belongs to the holy temple, and therefore good fortune has sent you to me instead, and we shall never part. Oh, he does not know that it was I who saved his life, thought the little mermaid. I carried him across the sea to the forest where the temple stood. I hid him I hid behind the rock and watched over him until he was found. I saw that beautiful girl whom he loves more than me, and the little mermaid sighed deeply, for cry she couldn't. He had said that the girl belongs to the holy temple, and will never come out into this world, and they will never meet again. But I am with him and see him every day. I will take care of him, love him, and devote my life to him. Everyone said that the young prince was to be married. He was to have the neighboring king's daughter, a beautiful princess. A magnificent ship was built and made ready. It was announced that the prince was traveling to see the neighboring kingdom, but that no one believed. It is not the country, but the princess he is to inspect, they all agreed. The little mermaid shook her head and smiled. She knew what the prince thought, and they didn't. I must go, he told her. I must look at the beautiful princess. My parents demand it, but they won't force me to carry her home as my bride. I can't love her. She does not look like the girl from the temple as you do. If I ever marry, I shall most likely choose you, my little foundling with the eloquent eyes. And he kissed her on her red lips, and played with her long hair, and let his head rest so near her heart that it dreamed of human happiness and an immortal soul. Are you afraid of the ocean, my little silent child? Asked the prince as they stood on the deck of the splendid ship that was to sail them to the neighboring kingdom. He told the little mermaid how the sea can be still or stormy, about how the fishes that live in it, and what the divers had seen underneath the water. She smiled as he talked, for who knew better than she about the world on the bottom of the ocean? In the moonlit night, when everyone slept but the sailor at the rudder and the lookout in the bow, she sat and looked down into the clear water. She thought she saw her father's palace, and on top of its tower, her old grandmother, who was standing with her silver crown on her head, looking up through the currents of the sea toward the keel of the ship. Her sisters came. They looked at her so sorrowfully she wrung their little hands in despair. She waved to them and smiled. She wanted them to know that she was happy, but just at that moment the little cabin boy came, and her sisters dived down under the water. He saw nothing but some white foam on the ocean. The next morning the ship sailed into harbor of the great town that belonged to the neighboring king. All the church bells were ringing, and from the tall towers trumpets blew. And while the soldiers stood at attention with banners flying and bayonets on their rifles, every day another banquet was held, and balls and parties followed one after the other. But the princess attended none of them, for she did not live in the palace. She was being educated in the holy temple, where she was to learn all the royal virtues. But at last she came. The little mermaid wanted ever so much to see her, and when she finally did, she had to admit that a more beautiful girl she had never seen before. Her skin was so delicate and fine, and beneath her long dark lashes smiled a pair of faithful dark blue eyes. It is you, exclaimed the prince. You are the one who saved me when I lay dead on the beach. And he embraced his blushing bride. Oh, now I am too happy, he said to the little mermaid. That which I never dared to hope has now happened. You will share my joy, for I know that you love me more than any of the others do. The little mermaid kissed his hand. She felt as if her heart were breaking. His wedding morning would bring her death, and she would be changed into foam on the ocean. All the church bells rang, and heralds rode through the streets and announced the wedding to the people. On all the altars, costly silver lamps burned with fragrant oils. The priests swung censers with burning incense in them, while the prince and the princess gave each other their hand, and the bishop blessed them. The little mermaid, dressed in silk and gold, held the train of the bride's dress, but her ears did not hear the music, did her eyes see the holy ceremony, for this night would bring her death, and she was thinking of all she had lost in this world. The bride and bridegroom embarked upon the prince's ship. Cannon saluted and banners flew. On the main deck, a tent of gold and scarlet cloth had been raised. There, on the softest of pillows, the bridal couple would sleep. Their sails were unfurled, and they swelled in the wind, and the ship glided across the transparent sea. When it darkened and evening came, colored lamps were lit, and the sailors danced on the deck. The little mermaid could not help remembering the first time she had emerged above the waves, when she had seen almost identical sight. She whirled in the dance, glided as the swallow does in the air when it is pursed. Everyone cheered and applauded her. Never had she danced so beautifully. The sharp knives cut her feet, but she did not feel it, for the pain in her heart was far greater. She knew that this was the last evening that she would see him for whose sake she had given away her lovely voice and left her home and her family, and he would never know of her sacrifice. It was the last night that she would breathe the same air as he, or look out the over the deep sea and up into the star blue heaven. A dreamless, eternal night awaited her, for she had no soul and she had not been able to win one. Until midnight, all was gaiety about the ship, and the mermaid danced and laughed with the thought of death in her heart. Then the prince kissed his bride, and she fondled his long black hair, and arm in arm they walked into the splendorous tent to sleep. The ship grew quiet. Only the sailor at the helm and the little mermaid were awake. She stood with her white arms resting on the railings and looked toward the east. She searched the horizon for the pink of dawn. She knew that the first sunbeams would kill her. Out on the sea rose her sisters, but the wind could no longer play with their long, beautiful hair, for their heads had been shorn. We have given our hairs to the sea witch, so that she would help you, and you would not have to die this night. Here is the knife that witch has given us. Look how sharp it is. Before the sun rises, you must plunge it into the heart of the prince. When his warm blood sprays on your feet, they will turn into a fishtail, and you will be a mermaid again. You will be able to live your 300 years down in the sea with us before you die and become foam on the ocean. Hurry! He or you must die before the sun rises. Our grandmother mourns. She too has no hair. Hers has fallen out from grief. Kill the prince and come back to us. Hurry! See, there is a pink haze on the horizon. Soon the sun will rise and you will die. The little mermaid heard the sound of her sisters, deep and strange, sighing, before they disappeared beneath the waves. She pulled aside the crimson cloth of the tent and saw the beautiful bride sleeping peacefully with her head resting on the prince's chest. The little mermaid bent down, kissed his handsome forehead. She turned and looked at the sky. More and more it was turning red. She glanced at the sharp knife, and once more she looked down at the prince. He moved a little in his sleep and whispered the name of his bride. Only she was in his thoughts, in his dreams. The little mermaid's hand trembled as it squeezed the handle of the knife. Then she threw the weapon out into the sea. The waves turned red where it fell, as if drops of blood were seeping up through the water. Again she looked at the prince. Her eyes were already glazed in death. She threw herself into the sea and felt her body changing into foam. The sun rose out of the sea. Its rays felt warm and soft on the deathly cold foam. But the little mermaid did not feel death. She saw the sun, and above her floated hundreds of airy, transparent forms. She could see right through them, see the sails of the ship and the blood red clouds. Their voices were melodious, so spiritual and tender that no human ear could hear them, just as their forms were so fragile and fine that no human eye could see them. So light were they that they glided through the air, through though they had no wings. The little mermaid looked down and saw that she had an eternal body like theirs. "Where am I?" she asked, and her voices sounded like theirs, so lovely and so melodious that no human music could reproduce it. "We are the daughters of the air," they answered. "Mermaids have no immortal soul, and cannot have one unless they can obtain the love of a human being. Their chance of obtaining eternal life depends upon others. We, daughters of the air, have not received an eternal soul either, but we can win one by good deeds. We fly to the warm countries where the heavy air of the plague rests, and blow cool winds to spread it. We carry the smell of flowers that refresh and heal the sick. It is for 300 years we earnestly try to do what is good. We obtain an immortal soul and can take part in the eternal happiness of man. You, little mermaid, have tried with all your heart to do the same. You have suffered and borne your suffering bravely, and that is what you are now among us, the spirit of the air. Do your good deeds, and in 300 years an immortal soul will be yours." The little mermaid lifted her arm up towards God's Son, and for the first time she felt a tear. She heard noise coming from the ship. She saw the prince and the princess searching for her. Sadly, they looked at the sea as if they knew she had thrown herself into the waves. Without being seen, she kissed the bride's forehead and smiled at the prince. Then she rose together with the other children of the air up into the pink cloud that was sailing by. "In 300 years I shall rise like this into God's kingdom," she said. "You may also be able to go there before that," whispered one of the others to her. "Invisibly, we fly through the homes of the human beings that can see us, so they don't know when we are there. But if they find a good child who makes his parents happy and deserves their love, we smile, and God takes a year away from the time of our trial. But if there is a naughty and mean child in the house, we come to and we cry. For every tear we shed, God adds a day to the 300 years we already must serve." The end.